That's kind of double. Listen. This is important, what Jesus is getting ready to tell us. And so he goes on to tell Nicodemus about the importance of being born again. And Jesus in verse 5 then begins to talk about the Spirit and water. Now, don't misunderstand what Jesus isn't saying. He is not saying that baptism has salvation power. If somebody completely rejected baptism, that could possibly be something. But Jesus is specifically talking to the spiritual matter that happens in a person's life. Nicodemus came to have a philosophical conversation with Jesus. He didn't understand that he was getting ready to talk to God. He had no reference for what Jesus was trying to tell him. He, in this first part, doesn't realize that Jesus is trying to explain to Nicodemus how he can have an intimate relationship with the Father. C.S. Lewis is another great mind that Christianity's got to have. Before he became a Christian, though, at the age of 14, he became an atheist. And so he lived several years just denying God because he had lost a close friend. And finally, as he was teaching at a college, and he had some friends, J.R. Tolkien was one of them that wrote The Lord of the Rings. As he had these friends that were Christians kind of working on him, he says this about his conversion. He says, "You must picture that room that I was in night after night, feeling whenever my mind lifted from my work for a second, that steady, unrelenting approach of Him who I earnestly desired not to meet. That which I greatly feared had at last come upon me. In the Trinity term of 1929, I gave in. I admitted that God was God, and I knelt and prayed. Perhaps that night I prayed the most reluctant convert in all of England." C.S. Lewis, much like Nicodemus, had no idea that when God sought him out, there was nothing he could do but say yes. And as we look at this conversation between Nicodemus and Jesus, you have to understand that part of your salvation is faith in God's mystery. Jesus in verse 7 continues this dialogue and says, "Don't be amazed at this. The wind blows where it wants, and you don't know where it goes, but you have faith in it." Jesus is pointing out the problem that Nicodemus has. He can have faith in God in these simple natural miracles, but when Jesus is bringing to him this idea of spiritual regeneration, he has no context for it. And so Jesus kind of goes on and he points out, hey, aren't you a great teacher? Don't you know the law? And yet you don't even understand what I'm trying to tell you? Isn't that a problem? If you're the great teacher of Israel and you can't understand these basic things, something doesn't seem right. And as he tells him in verse 11, again, truly, truly, or listen, you don't take what I've said as a testimony or those who have come before me, the prophets and the great leaders of Israel. You're not understanding where we're coming from. We're not coming at this from the law. We're not coming at this from an ideological position. Nicodemus, I'm sure, didn't have a problem with Jonah in the well. And y'all remember that story, the story of Jonah in the well. God comes to Jonah, says, I'm going to send you to Nineveh. Jonah says no, and he goes the other way. He jumps a ship, and as it's sailing, he gets caught up in a storm. And the sailors are there, so they draw straws, and Jonah had the short straw, so Jonah says, throw me overboard. They throw him overboard. And a big fish or a big whale comes up and eats Jonah, and Jonah kind of camps out and has revival for 3 days, and then finally the fish spits him up on dry ground. He goes to Nineveh, and he does what God wanted him to do the whole time. I'm sure Nicodemus preached that story with the best of them and wholeheartedly believed it. You know, and also Nicodemus has stories of Moses taking the children of Israel on dry ground twice. And he believed those stories. And he believed the stories of Elijah and Elijah and all the miracles that they did and calling down fire from heaven. He believed those things. But he had a difficult time believing what Jesus had to say. I think we have a tendency to do that in our own lives. We have a tendency to say, you know, God can make a sea dry in a few hours so people can walk across it. But He can't reach down and get me out of this problem. We have a tendency to say, yeah, Jesus died and rose again, but, you know, He can't help this person overcome that addiction. If Creator God could come down and die and raise 3 days later, none of our problems are going to be too difficult for Him. I think that's what Jesus was trying to point out to Nicodemus. That God's love is your salvation. As we continue in John, verse 13, we kind of find he's starting to preach, you know. He's been talking with Nicodemus. He's been chatting with Nicodemus. And now Jesus says, okay, no more talking from you. I'm going to preach. And so he begins to tell Nicodemus this good news. You know, he says that no one has ascended to heaven or descended except the Son of Man. And then he goes on in verse 14 to talk about how Moses lifted the serpent up. Now, Jesus is specifically referring to in Numbers when when Moses lifted up a serpent to save the children of Israel. Jesus is directly relating what is going to happen to him on the cross as what happened to the children of Israel, trying to put this in terms that Nicodemus could understand. And then he comes to verse 16, John 3:16, the verse that so many of us point to and say, that is the verse in which God spoke to me and I accepted Him. The verse that we fully understand. And it says, for God so loved the world, or another version of it is, in this way God showed His love, that He gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in Him will not perish but have everlasting life. Jesus, in a private conversation with just him and Nicodemus, says the verse that we hold up and we say all of Scripture is explained through this one verse. He tells a verse in a private conversation that most of us would point to and say, that's when God spoke to me. Jesus goes on to talk about He didn't come to judge the world, but that to show the world the light. Jesus kind of got away from this philosophical debate with Nicodemus. There's a movie that I really like called Hitch. And it's got Will Smith and another actor named Kevin James. And the background story of it is Will Smith is kind of this love doctor. And he teaches these guys